The diner was nearly empty when the storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the broad glass windows, turning the neon sign outside into a trembling blur of red and blue. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food lingered in the air, mixed with the faint hum of the jukebox that hadn't played all night. Maria adjusted the tray in her hands, her thin fingers trembling slightly as she balanced 2 steaming plates of steak and eggs. She'd been on her feet for 12 hours straight, but exhaustion was a luxury she couldn't afford. The rent notice folded in her apron pocket reminded her of that with every step she took. She moved carefully, her worn sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, her dark hair tied back hastily, a strand falling loose to frame the tired beauty of her face. At booth 7, a man sat with his back to the storm. He looked like he didn't belong there, like marble dropped in mud. His suit was sharp, cut to perfection, black with a subtle sheen that caught the flickering fluorescent lights. His watch gleamed when his fingers tapped impatiently against the menu, and the diner's cracked leather booth seemed unworthy of his presence. Maria didn't know his name yet, but the rest of the staff had whispered the moment he walked in. A CEO. Big company. Money like you can't imagine. They'd said it with half awe, half fear, as though he might own not just the city but the very air they breathed. She approached quietly, her tray steady, her smile practiced but faint. "Your order, sir," she said softly, sliding the plate onto the table. He didn't look up at first. His phone buzzed, his eyes scanning some urgent message. His jaw was tight, the kind of tightness that comes from carrying the weight of empires. When he finally lifted his gaze, Maria felt it like a spotlight, sharp, assessing, a man who wasn't used to being interrupted. "Thank you," he said, clipped, polite but cold. She nodded quickly and stepped back, folding her hands before her apron. She meant to turn away, to vanish into the rhythm of refilling coffee cups and wiping down counters, but something in his eyes caught her. A flicker, not of power, but of pain. Something hidden beneath the polish of wealth and authority. And then it happened. As Maria leaned slightly to set down the second plate, the chain around her neck slipped free from the collar of a uniform. A small silver locket dangled forward, glinting in the neon light. It was old, scratched, the kind of trinket that held more value in memory than in gold. She reached quickly to tuck it back beneath her blouse, embarrassed. But it was too late. The CEO's fork stopped in mid-air. His eyes froze on the locket as though the world had just tilted off its axis. His hand trembled once, then tightened around the utensil until his knuckles whitened. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low, edged with something that wasn't anger but cut just as sharply. Maria blinked, startled. "This? It was my mother's," she said softly, her instinct to protect the one thing she had left of her family. But his stare didn't soften. If anything, it deepened, as though the locket had reached into his chest and pulled out a wound he'd buried years ago. He leaned forward slightly, the storm raging outside echoing the storm that suddenly rose in his eyes. Maria took a small step back, clutching the tray tighter to her chest. The silence between them thickened, heavy with questions she didn't understand. The diner's door creaked open just then, wind sweeping in with a cold shiver. A little girl darted in, her raincoat dripping, boots splashing onto the wet floor. She couldn't have been more than 6, her dark curls damp, her cheeks flushed pink from a storm. She spotted the CEO instantly and rushed toward him with a delighted cry. "Daddy!" The word cracked the air like thunder. Maria's eyes widened as she turned from the child to the man, to the locket he still couldn't tear his gaze from. The little girl climbed into the booth beside him, oblivious to the tension, her small hands tugging at his sleeve. "Daddy, can I have pancakes? Please?" The CEO's hand hovered over the table, his eyes still locked on Maria. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The locket shimmered faintly at her chest, and in his eyes, Maria saw something raw, recognition, disbelief, and a grief so deep it nearly frightened her. The storm outside howled, but inside the diner, it was another kind of storm entirely. Maria swallowed hard, clutching the tray, her heart pounding. She didn't know why this man, this stranger, looked at her like that, like she was the ghost of someone he thought he'd lost. And before she could move, before she could ask, His voice came again, softer this time, filled with a weight that made her breath catch. That locket, it doesn't belong to you. Maria's fingers instinctively curled around the locket, tucking it back under her blouse as if hiding it could erase the intensity in his eyes. The tray she held felt heavier now, her balance shaky as the silence thickened between them. It was my mother's, she repeated, her voice barely more than a whisper. She tried to steady herself, to sound firm, but the words felt fragile in the air. The CEO leaned back in the booth, his arm draped protectively around his daughter. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew harder, more unreadable, like a mask fitted tightly over something breaking beneath. That locket, he said again, slowly, is not just your mother's. I've seen it before. Maria's brow furrowed. Confusion and unease mingled in her chest. She wanted to retreat, to step away, to disappear into the safety of the kitchen. But her feet stayed planted, as though the storm outside had pinned her there. The little girl, oblivious to the adult currents swirling around her, tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, pancakes," she reminded him, her voice lilting and innocent. Then she looked up at Maria with wide eyes. "Please, can you bring pancakes?" Maria blinked, her grip on the tray loosening. The child's innocence disarmed her. She managed a small nod. "Of course," she said, her voice breaking slightly. She turned to retreat, but the CEO's voice followed her, quiet yet commanding. "Wait." Maria froze mid-step. The tray pressed against her stomach, the plates rattling faintly. She looked over her shoulder. His gaze hadn't softened, but something else lingered there now. Hesitation, conflict, a weight heavier than simple curiosity. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing to the booth across from him. Maria stayed at him, stunned. "Sir, I'm working. I can't." "You can," he interrupted firmly, but his tone wasn't cruel. It was desperate. His daughter glanced between them, sensing something she couldn't name, her small hands folded patiently as if waiting for answers. Maria hesitated, her heart racing. To sit with him would mean exposing herself more, and she'd built her life on staying unseen. Another waitress, another shadow in the city. But the way he looked at her, like she held a piece of a puzzle he couldn't finish, rooted her to the spot. Finally, she slid into the booth across from him. The cracked leather stuck slightly to her damp uniform, the smell of rain still clinging to her. She set the tray aside and folded her hands on the table, her knuckles pale. He studied her, his eyes sharp and searching. "What's your name?" "Maria," she said quietly. His lips pressed into a line. "Maria," he repeated, as if tasting the word, as if it unlocked something old in him. His daughter leaned into his side, watching Maria with open curiosity. The CEO's voice dropped lower, private, almost pained. "Your mother, what was her name?" Maria's throat tightened. It had been years since she'd said it aloud, but the memory was a lantern in the dark. "Elena," she whispered. At the sound of it, his face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. His jaw slackened slightly, his eyes flickered with recognition. He leaned back, exhaling as though the name itself had struck him like a blow. Maria frowned, alarmed. "Why? Did you know her?" He didn't answer immediately. His hand rested on the table now, fingers tapping once before curling into a fist. His daughter looked up at him, sensing the shift. "Daddy," she whispered, her small voice tugging him back to the present. He forced a smile for her, brushing her curls back gently. "It's nothing," he said softly, but his eyes betrayed the lie. Maria shook her head, her pulse quickening. "Please," she said, surprising herself with the urgency in her tone. "If you know something about my mother." Her words trailed off, choked by a sudden swell of grief she hadn't expected. Elena had died when Maria was just a teenager, leaving her to fend for herself. The locket was all she had left, a tiny silver heart with faded initials inside. The CEO's gaze dropped to the table. "Your mother she was someone I once knew. A long time ago." Maria's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt. "That's not possible," she murmured, shaking her head. She never mentioned." "She wouldn't have," he cut in quietly, his voice rough. Because she left before I could tell her. The air seemed to thin around Maria. She gripped the edge of the table, steadying herself, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't form fast enough. The little girl broke the silence, leaning toward Maria with innocent curiosity. "Do you have children?" she asked, her tone light, her eyes sparkling. Elena and we shared something, a bond. But when she disappeared, I thought it was over. I thought she'd chosen a different life, far away from mine. Maria's mind reeled. She shook her head slowly. That doesn't make sense. My mother, she never mentioned you. Not once. She wouldn't, he said bitterly, almost to himself. She left before I could explain. Before I could, his voice trailed off, but the weight of unfinished sentences lingered between them. The little girl turned back toward them, her eyes wide and curious. "Daddy, who are you talking about?" His hand reached instinctively for hers, pulling her close. He forced a smile for her sake. "Just an old friend," he said softly, though the words sounded hollow. Maria's chest tightened. Every instinct told her to stand up and walk away, to run from the weight of his revelations. But another part of her, stubborn, aching for answers, kept her rooted to the booth. "And my son?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady. "What connection could he possibly have to you?" The CEO's expression shifted. His gaze sharpened, almost fearful. He opened his mouth to speak, but the door of the diner slammed open, and the bell above it clattered violently. A gust of cold wind and rain swept in, carrying with it two men in dark suits. They scanned the room quickly, their movements crisp, military-like. Their eyes landed on the booth at once, and one of them leaned toward his wrist, muttering into a small earpiece. Maria stiffened. The hairs on her neck rose. These weren't regular customers. The CEO's demeanor changed instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the commanding presence of a man who had built empires and silenced rivals. He slid out of the booth, his hand tightening protectively around his daughter's shoulder. Maria stood too, gripping the table for balance. "Who are they?" she whispered urgently. He didn't answer, not directly. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice sharp. The men approached swiftly, their polished shoes leaving wet prints on the tile. One of them pulled a folded paper from his jacket, laying it flat on the table where Maria had been sitting seconds before. It wasn't a menu. It was a photo, grainy, taken from a distance. Her son's face stared up at her, frozen mid-step on a city sidewalk. Maria's stomach dropped. Her knees weakened. "No," she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The CEO grabbed the paper, crumpling it in his fist. His jaw was a line of steel, his eyes burning with rage. "Not here," he growled, turning his body between the men and his daughter. Maria's vision blurred, panic rising like a flood. "Why do they have a picture of my son?" she demanded, her voice shaking, louder now. The other customers in the diner turned their heads, whispers rippling through the room. The suited men didn't flinch. One of them spoke in a clipped, emotionless tone. "We need to talk, sir. It concerns both of them." His eyes flicked briefly toward Maria before returning to the CEO. The CEO's hand tightened on his daughter's shoulder. "Not here," he repeated, colder this time. His presence filled the space, daring them to push further. Maria's chest heaved, fear and confusion tangling inside her. She wanted to scream, to snatch the photo and demand answers, but the weight of the moment pinned her down. The little girl, sensing the tension, clung tighter to her father's arm. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered. He bent down, his expression softening only for her. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured. But his eyes betrayed the truth. They were anything but safe. The men didn't move. They stood like shadows, waiting, watching. Maria swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she whispered, "What's happening? Why do they know about my son? And why do you care so much?" The CEO turned to her, his eyes fierce, his voice low and deliberate. "Because, Maria," he said, his words slicing through the air, "your son may not just be your son. He might be mine too." The diner had grown too small for the weight of the revelation. Maria felt the walls closing in, the whispers of curious strangers pressing against her skin. She wanted to run, to scoop up her son from wherever he was and never look back. But the words the CEO had spoken still echoed in her ears. "He might be mine too." Her throat tightened. No, it couldn't be true. Could it? The two suited men had finally stepped outside, leaving the stormy silence behind. But their presence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The CEO, Daniel Hart, she remembered now, motioned to the waitress at the counter, tossing a crisp bill onto the table without even looking at it. Then, with his daughter still clinging to his side, he turned to Maria. "Come with me," he said, not a request but an instruction. Maria's first instinct was to refuse, to push back against the sheer force of his authority. But something in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't just power or control. It was fear, raw and unmasked, woven into the blue depths of his gaze. Fear for her son. She nodded, barely, and followed him out into the rain. They didn't drive to a mansion or a high-rise. Instead, Daniel led them to a quiet townhouse tucked into a row of brick homes, modest compared to the empire he was rumored to command. Inside, the space was warm, filled with the faint scent of cinnamon and the soft glow of lamplight. The little girl darted toward a shelf of picture books, pulling one down and curling onto the sofa. For a moment, Maria envied the child's ability to slip into comfort so easily. Daniel removed his coat and poured 2 glasses of water. He handed one to Maria, his hand brushing hers for the briefest moment. "Sit," he said gently this time, not as a command but as an invitation. Maria sank into the chair across from him, her frayed backpack still clutched to her chest like a shield. "Talk to me," Daniel said, his voice steady but low. "Tell me about your son." Her lips trembled as she spoke. "His name is Gabriel. He's 7. He loves drawing superheroes and hates carrots. He asks too many questions at bedtime, and he's the only reason I've kept going. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. But he's mine. He's all I have. No one else. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying her face with an intensity that made her squirm. Maria, Elena and I, your mother and I, we had something real. And then she vanished. No calls, no letters, nothing. I searched for her for years. And now you stand here, with a son about the age he'd be if, his words faltered. He looked away, his jaw tight. Maria's heart pounded. She shook her head. You can't just walk into my life and claim him. You don't know him. You don't know me. It was fleeting, and even as she felt it, she knew it could be ripped away in an instant. She met his gaze, her voice steady but low. If you're serious, if you truly want to be part of his life, then prove it. Not with money, not with words. Prove it with actions. Daniel leaned back slowly, nodding. His eyes didn't waver from hers. I will, he promised. And for the first time, Maria believed him. A fragile trust has been formed. A glimpse of love and family sparks. But will it survive the forces waiting outside their fragile peace? The next morning broke gray and heavy, the storm clouds still lingering. Maria woke early, curled in the armchair where she had finally drifted off, her frayed backpack still against her chest. She blinked at the soft sound of laughter, gentle, bright. She turned her head and froze. Gabriel was there. He sat cross-legged on the carpet, crayons scattered around him. The little girl, Lily, was beside him, giggling as he drew a crooked superhero with wild hair. Daniel knelt between them, tie loosened, his suit jacket set aside. He wasn't the towering CEO she'd seen the day before. He was just a father, awkwardly trying to color inside the lines. Maria's breath caught. It looked like a family, her family, but reality tugged at her chest. This wasn't safe. The men in suits, the photograph of her son, those shadows weren't gone. They were waiting, watching. She rose quietly, but Daniel noticed. His eyes softened as he stood, moving toward her. "Is incredible," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The way he talks, the way he imagines, is more than I ever dreamed." Maria's lips trembled. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she whispered back. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not making promises. I'm making choices. I won't let anyone touch him. Or you." His voice was steel now. "Not while I'm breathing." Before she could reply, a sharp knock rattled the door. Maria stiffened. Daniel's eyes darkened, but he didn't hesitate. He opened the door to find the two suited men again, their expressions grave. "So," one said firmly, "we need an answer. The boy isn't safe out here in the open. Neither is she." His eyes flicked toward Maria. Daniel stepped into the doorway, blocking their view of the children. "You don't speak to her. You don't go near him. If you want me involved, you deal with me directly. But they stay out of it." The man's jaw tightened. "You're risking everything." Daniel leaned closer, his voice cold and absolute. "I've built empires. I've fought wars in boardrooms you'll never step foot in. But this is the only fight that matters. And I'm not losing it." The men exchanged a glance, then stepped back into the rain, their silence more threatening than words. Daniel shut the door and locked it, his chest rising and falling with force. He turned back to Maria, his face raw with determination. "You asked me to prove it," he said quietly. "That was the beginning." Maria's throat ached. She wanted to argue, to protect herself from hope. But the way he looked at her, the way his daughter laughed with Gabriel in the next room, it was undoing her walls brick by brick. That evening, as rain gave way to a pale gold sunset, they all gathered at the small wooden table. The children insisted on pizza, and so Daniel, the feared CEO, clumsily rolled dough in his spotless kitchen while flour dusted his expensive shirt. Maria laughed in spite of herself, her heart softening as she watched him fumble with the oven. By the time the meal was ready, the table glowed with candlelight. Lily leaned against Maria's arm. Gabriel chatted about his drawings, and Daniel poured juice into mismatched glasses. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Halfway through the meal, Gabriel looked up at Daniel and asked, "Are you really my dad?" Silence fell. Maria's hand froze on her fork. Daniel met the boy's curious eyes, his voice steady but warm. "I don't know yet, Gabriel. But I know this. I want to be here for you. If you'll let me." Gabriel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but you have to eat pizza with us every Friday." Laughter broke the tension. Daniel reached across the table, brushing Maria's hand by accident, or maybe not by accident. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Trust, fragile but growing. Weeks later, the storm had faded into memory. Papers were filed, truths unearthed, and blood tests confirmed what their hearts had already begun to know. Gabriel was Daniel's son. But it wasn't the proof that mattered most. It was the nights Daniel read Gabriel's stories, the mornings Maria found him making pancakes in the kitchen, the way Lily slipped her small hand into Maria's when they walked to the park. The family they built wasn't forged from wealth, obligation. It was forged from choice, from moments of tenderness, from battles fought together instead of alone. The house was brighter now, its walls filled with photographs, birthdays, laughter, quiet mornings. Maria stood by the window one spring afternoon, watching Daniel toss a ball across the yard to Gabriel, now taller, stronger, laughing freely. Lily twirled nearby with ribbons in her hair, her voice carrying on the breeze. Daniel caught Maria's gaze through the glass and smiled, a smile that held every promise he had once made and kept. She pressed her hand to the window pane, her heart swelling. Years ago, she had been a waitress with nothing but a frayed backpack and a tired smile. Now, she had a family, a home, a love that had been fought for and won. And as the golden light spilled across the yard, Maria knew this truth. Sometimes the greatest stories don't begin with power or wealth. Sometimes they begin with a locket, a memory, and a chance encounter that changes everything. Like, subscribe please, and tell your country name in comments.